Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. And welcome to newcomers, friends, and members. My name is Reverend Kim, and as many of you know, I'm a regular guest preacher here at UUFP. The leadership of UUFP and I are glad that you're here this morning, and we hope you'll find ample room in this community for your spirit. This is a community that welcomes all who are in sympathy with our principles, whoever you are, whoever you love, whatever your circumstances. Unitarian Universalism has a rich history, and we provide a spiritual home for people with diverse beliefs. If you're visiting this morning, we'd love the opportunity to talk with you further and welcome your questions after the service. Are there any announcements? If you have an announcement, I invite you to come forward and you can give your announcement from this microphone right here.
Good morning, I'm Sam. I was buying filters for the furnace and the air conditioning system, and I looked at the wrong filters, so I bought the wrong size. So I have two brand new filters I just took out of the wrap. They're out in the hallway, so if you want them, please take them because we can't use them in the furnace unless they're too big. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Well, they're 16 by 24 by 1.
I do have one announcement. We had planned to do a workshop on compassionate listening after the service today, and I know there are quite a few of you here this morning, but there are also a number of people who are off preparing to see the eclipse tomorrow. So we're going to reschedule that workshop for another time. And now let's light our chalice. Thank you, Vince, for volunteering to be our chalice lighter this morning. May this flame be as the light of wisdom in our minds and as the warmth of love in our hearts. Our opening hymn, sorry, getting ahead of myself. I'm going to be doing the worship associate and regular parts today. So next we have our opening words. These come from Scott Taylor and they've been adapted. Come into this circle of compassion and care. Bring your worry and your wounds. Bring your longings and your hope. Word and song, we rekindle the connection that soothes our tender hearts. With stillness and space to pause, we restore our strength for the work that must be done. The work of love, the work of waiting, the work of repair, and the work of remembering that we are not alone. Come, let us worship together. Our opening hymn this morning is number 1010 in your teal hymnals. We give thanks. I invite you to stand as you are able. come forward. I know Megan has a story for us. Children can get mats to sit on, to make yourself more comfortable if you'd like.
So our story today is called Here We Are. Here we are. Well, hello. Welcome to this planet we call Earth. It is the big globe floating in space on which we live. We're glad you found us, as space is very big. There's so much to see and do here on Earth, so let's get started with a quick tour. The planet is basically made up of two parts, the land and the sea. Firstly, let's talk about the land. It's where you're standing on right now. We know lots about the land. Then there is the sea, which is full of wonderful things. We know a bit about the sea, but we'll talk some more about that once you've learned to swim. There's also the sky, though that can be pretty complicated. Okay, moving on. On our planet, there are people. One people is a person. You are a person, you have a body. Look after it, as most bits don't grow back. The most important thing for people is to remember are to eat, drink, and stay warm. People come in many shapes, sizes, and colors. We may all look different, act different, and sound different, but don't be fooled, we are all people. There are animals too. They come in even more shapes, sizes, and colors. They can't speak, though. That's no reason to not be nice to them. You may not be able to speak yet either, even though your head is filled with questions, but be patient. You'll learn how to use words soon enough. Generally, how it works is that when the sun is out, it's daytime and we do stuff. The rest of the time, it's night. When it's dark, save for the moon, we sleep. Please. Things can sometimes move slowly here on Earth. More often, though, they move quickly. So use your time well. It will be gone before you know it. Though we've come a long way, we haven't quite worked everything out, so there's plenty left to do. You will figure out lots of things by yourself. Just remember to leave notes for everyone else. It looks big, Earth, but there are lots of us here, so be kind. There is enough for everyone. Well, that is planet Earth. Make sure you look after it, as it's all we've got. Now, if you ever need to know anything else, just ask. I won't be far away. And when I'm not around, you can always ask someone else. You're never alone on Earth.
Again, let's sing the children out to their class. We were going to have a choir anthem this morning, but we have converted that into a congregational hymn because the choir is elsewhere, mostly elsewhere this morning. So we have a song, let's see, what is the hymn number again, please? 1020, yeah. So it's number 1020 in your hymnals, and it is around we're going to sing it primarily as a unison. Not 10:23. I had it open a second ago. All right, 10:23. Building bridges, but if you feel adventurous, you could start at any of those other points. There's 4 opportunities to start singing. So we'll just sing and see what happens. I'm sure it's gonna sound great. So are you gonna play it through one time for us, and then we'll start it either right away, or we'll wait 1 line or 2 lines or 3 lines. Sing it through 4 times. You can stand as you're able. We're going to enter into a time of meditation now, and let's begin by remaining seated and singing hymn number 123 in your gray hymnals, and that's Spirit of Life. Loving God, we pause in the stillness to rest for a moment, to quiet ourselves, so that we can feel what stirs within us. Each breath draws us closer to the pulse of life, and with each exhalation we make room for something new. May we find in this gathering the comfort of those who care. May we encounter patience along our growing edges and compassion in our most tender spots. Here, may we find the inspiration and encouragement we need to face our challenges and nurture ourselves. And in the presence of suffering across the globe, may we redouble our efforts to practice kindness where we are, with the hope that the light of our actions travels like the light of faraway stars. May our gestures of compassion and generosity seed possibility. May we travel humbly with one another, choosing reconciliation over resentment as we try to live right-sized. When life presses in and shifts us off balance, when pain assails us, when frustration mounts, may the rhythm of our breath steady us and bring us back to a place of gratitude. May it be so. Let's spend about a minute in silence as we notice our breath, our in-breath and our out-breath. May that rhythm steady us and bring us back to a place of gratitude. a time in our service for giving and receiving this morning's offering. As Unitarian Universalists, the central part of our worship is the opportunity to practice generosity and gratitude. Through your annual pledges and weekly donations, together, members and friends support the mission of UUFP. Nurturing spiritual journeys, embracing diversity, celebrating community, and turning values into action. Thank you in advance for your generosity. Our reading this morning is from Thich Nhat Hanh, and it comes from an interview that I transcribed, an interview with Oprah Winfrey from 2012. Deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of another person. We can call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose: to help him or her to empty their heart. And if you remember that you were helping him or her to suffer less, then even if they say things full of wrong perceptions, full of bitterness, you are still capable of continuing to listen with compassion. Because you know that listening like that, with compassion, you give them a chance to suffer less. If you want to help him or her to correct their perception, then you wait for another time. But for this, the time being, you just listen with compassion and help him or her to suffer less. 1 hour like that can bring transformation and healing. The fear, the anger, and the despair are born on the ground of wrong perception. We have wrong perceptions concerning ourselves and the other person, and that is the foundation for conflict and war and violence. We should be able to say, "Dear friends, dear people, I know that you suffer a lot. I have not understood enough of your difficulties and suffering. It's not our intention to make you suffer more. It is the opposite. So please tell us about your suffering, your difficulties. I'm eager to learn, to understand." You have to start like that, with loving speech, and if you are honest, they will open their heart and tell us, and then we are practicing compassionate, deep listening. I invite you to join now in singing in your gray hymnals, number 95, "There is More Love Somewhere." The other day, I came across something I'd written in 2017. It's 7 years ago now. I said one of the most troubling things that I've been seeing, especially since the election, yes, that election, is that people who have different political beliefs don't seem to be able to talk to each other. I went on. I hear from people who say that they avoid talking to certain neighbors or acquaintances, or even some friends and family members, or they do talk, but they always end up in an argument. Well, sadly, that hasn't changed in 7 years. And in fact, it's getting worse, as I think we've all seen. I've been pondering a question that President Obama voiced recently, and that is, how do we see, hear, listen to each other in ways that allow us to meet and respect and recognize stories that enable us to then engage in common work? This is not a new question. In fact, it's a question that the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh spent most of his life answering. This gentle, humble monk from Vietnam was called by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. an apostle of peace and nonviolence when King nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. When war came to Vietnam in the mid-1950s, Thich Nhat Hanh and other Buddhist monks and nuns were faced with the dilemma of whether to stay in the monasteries and continue meditating, or to go out and help those around them who were suffering from the bombings and the other devastating effects of the war. Thich Nhat Hanh chose to do both, and that decision led him to developing what's called now the engaged Buddhism movement. Several years earlier, he began traveling to the US and Europe, and several years later, he began traveling to the US and Europe and speaking in hundreds of venues to make the case for peace, calling for an end to the hostilities in Vietnam. A peace activist in the US named Jean Knudsen Hoffman arranged for Thich Nhat Hanh's first visit here, where he went on a speaking tour and led workshops with Vietnam vets. Part of his message was this. He said, if we align ourselves with one side or the other, we will lose our chance to work for peace. Reconciliation is to understand all sides. His vision was to have listening groups all over the world, wherever there was conflict, and this was the beginning of his mission to encourage what came to be called the practice of compassionate listening. He challenged peacemakers to stay connected to all sides of a conflict, to humanize the people who were on the other sides. It can be easy for us to look back at those times and say, well, what good did that peace work do? We're still fighting and probably always will be. I think it's critical here that we take the long view. If we do that, then we might be able to see at least glimmers of progress. The arc of the universe is long, but it does bend toward justice. Futurist Kevin Kelly speaks to that bending. He observes that over the course of human history, quote, we've enlarged the circle of empathy around us, end quote. And we can see that if we think about some of the changes in just the past few centuries. He goes on to point out that, quote, our problems are a lot easier to see than the solutions, but also our capacity to solve problems is greater than we think. And our capacity to solve problems is growing. In order to create the future we want, we have to envision it. And we need to have faith that it's possible to get there. And remind ourselves that major changes in human attitudes can take a long time. But change is happening. Within any movement for social change, there are always numerous groups working toward the same goal, each with different strategies and approaches. But until the most effective tactics are worked out, sometimes groups are at odds with each other. And that's what happened back in the 60s and 70s. There were peace activists in the US that became frustrated with people like Jean Hoffman because she had taken up Thich Nhat Hanh's call to stay connected to all sides of a conflict. Jean took small groups with her to listen to people like the notorious Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. In Nicaragua, they listened to both the Contras and the Sandinistas. She talked with Palestinian Yasser Arafat and the Israelis. These frustrated peace activists were outraged that Jean and the delegation members were listening to the other side. Meanwhile, there was another group of devoted peace workers who simply weren't seeing the changes they had hoped for. A peace activist named Leah Green in the early 90s, during the same time Jean was doing her peace work, had been leading delegations to Israel to listen to Israelis and Palestinians. I took a course with Leah 7 years ago, and she told us, as an American Jewish woman who had lived in Israel and worked in the West Bank, my original vision was to strengthen US support for Middle East peace by connecting Americans to Israeli and Palestinian reconciliation leaders and providing these Americans with a firsthand experience of the complexities on the ground. But despite their best intentions, to their chagrin, Leah and the other leaders found that the peace group members on these trips weren't really changed by the experience. They came into the listening sessions already aligned with one side or the other, and they simply used the trip to validate their positions. They didn't truly listen to the other side. It was incredibly painful for Leah to realize that these peace group members were actually adding to the conflict and polarization because they had no structure, no tools to help them connect to the perspective of the so-called other side. Something was definitely missing, and Leah didn't know what it was. In 1996, after leading 9 of these delegations, she was at a low point, and she sought out Jean Hoffman, thinking that maybe Jean could help. Jean became her trusted mentor. Leah learned that Thich Nhat Hanh was one of Jean's teachers, and Jean explained that the essence of the listening approach she was using comes from his teachings, a call for peacemakers to initiate humanizing contact and to cultivate compassion for those on all sides of a conflict. This was a turning point for Leah. She realized that it was the heart that was the missing piece. The heart was the secret tool that her peace work had been lacking. She adopted Jean's framework for compassionate listening as an overarching structure for the delegations, and she and Jean began traveling together to launch the Compassionate Listening Project in Israel and Palestine. Jean died in 2010, but the Compassionate Listening Project has gone on to do reconciliation work in many other parts of the world and here in the US. Leah and others also adapted their trainings for peace building in everyday life. They began to teach in the US in 1999, and the trainings have continued to develop and grow. The focus has widened to include teaching participants how to listen with compassion in any situation. The Compassionate Listening Project teaches powerful skills for peacemaking in our families, in our communities, on the job, and in social change work locally and globally. At the beginning of 2017, I took an introductory course with the Compassionate Listening Project online. It was done on a platform that at that time was considered novel. It was held on Zoom. And now I've begun training with the Compassionate Listening Project on Zoom to become a certified course facilitator myself, which I'm very excited about. And we're working with people from all over the world. Somebody in Nigeria, somebody in Malaysia, someone else in Israel, Palestinian woman. So it's very exciting to see what is coming of these early compassionate listening roots. From its beginnings as an experiment in peacemaking, the Compassionate Listening Project has developed time-tested specific practices that lead to genuine transformation and deep understanding between people. Compassionate listening begins with the premise that each of us has a pure core essence of love and compassion that we were born with. And this core essence is anchored in the heart. But a layer forms around the heart, a layer of wounding or suffering that happens as we move along on the journey of life. It's the one thing that we have in common with every other human being on earth. The pain of being judged or self-judgment. We may carry pain from abuse, pain from trauma, from war, from racism, sexism, homophobia. Over the years, we may develop layers of armor over our hearts to protect ourselves. But what happens in the process is that we're also closing off access to our hearts and access to that core of love and compassion. So the first practice in compassionate listening is to cultivate compassion. This includes developing empathy, being willing to step into another person's shoes, seeing and feeling the world from another person's perspective to the extent that we can. It includes feeling and expressing gratitude and developing the ability to forgive and to let go of old hurts. Cultivating compassion really is like building a muscle. The second practice is to develop what in compassionate listening is called the fair witness. The fair witness is the part of us that can observe our own thoughts and emotions and what's happening in our bodies and with our spirits. For many of us, when we're engaged in a conversation with someone who holds different values and different views, we get triggered. I think you all know what I'm talking about here. And when that happens, we have difficulty in managing our reactions. So we learn to use the fair witness to recognize and contain our triggers and to suspend judgment long enough to keep listening to another person's story. To paraphrase Thich Nhat Hanh, if we want to correct their wrong perceptions, we can do that later. But for now, we just focus on listening to them with compassion and then responding in ways to help them suffer less. Jean Knudsen-Hoffmann described compassionate listening as listening with a particular attitude, listening with a sort of spiritual ear. She said, it is non-judgmental, non-adversarial, and seeks the truth of the person in question. It seeks to see through any masks of hostility and fear to the sacredness of the individual, to discern their wounds. In our normal communication mode, we interrupt, we may roll our eyes, we may shake our head to indicate disagreement. We could jump in and say, oh, yes, something similar happened to me. Let me tell you about it. We might give advice or offer suggestions. We do all of these things quite naturally. It's just part of the culture that we come from. Or how many of us have listened just long enough to find the flaw in another person's thinking so that we can get all our arguments together and show, yeah, how right we are and how wrong they are, of course. And we do all of these things in our normal conversation. But when we know that someone needs our deep listening, it's different. In the practice of compassionate listening, we suspend judgment. Very different way of listening. And we don't plan how we want to respond. We accept the idea the truest, deepest guidance for a person resides within themselves. They have all the wisdom that they need Each person has the capacity to resolve and heal their conflicts. So our job isn't to fix or correct or revise or anything like that. Rather, it's to help create the space and the conditions that enable another person to discover trust in themselves and develop their own wisdom to live the life that's uniquely theirs. Often by simply just giving the other person the sacred space to be truly heard, a person's able to take an important step in their healing. As we listen with an open and compassionate heart, we learn to listen for facts, for feelings, and for values. What is happening in the story that they're telling? What emotions can we detect beneath their words or see in their faces? What are the values that sound important to them? As Thich Nhat Hanh has emphasized, the goal of listening with compassion is to help the other person to suffer less. That's the goal. So after the person has finished sharing their story, we respond. We've been listening from the heart, and now we respond from the heart. With a healing intention, we reflect back to the person the feelings, the facts, and the values that we have heard. As the person who has told the story, imagine being the person who's just been listened to. And just imagine how that might feel to receive the confirmation that you have indeed been heard. No one's going to jump in and tell you what to do. They've just listened. And imagine how that would feel to be the person who's done the listening and who's now reflecting back. To show a person that we've not only been listening with care, but that we understand them. This is to offer them a priceless gift. As Rachel Naomi Remen has written, listening creates a holy silence. When you listen generously to people, they can hear truth for themselves, often for the very first time. And in the silence of listening, you can know yourself in everyone. Eventually, you may be able to hear in everyone and beyond everyone, the unseen, singing softly to itself and to you. I invite you now to place a hand over your own heart. And imagine for a moment a time when you felt strongly anchored in your heart. No stress, no fear, no worry. Maybe you were with someone you love, a partner, a family member, a child. How did your heart feel? What kinds of feelings and qualities did you experience? A sense of connection, a feeling of openness, compassion. This is where your heart is when you do compassionate listening. And in this short time, I can only tell you a little bit about compassionate listening and how to practice it. But maybe we'll have an opportunity at some point in the future to do some more of this. But for now, let's imagine if we could be part of realizing Thich Nhat Hanh's vision, a vision which has been carried by many others of groups around the world who would practice deep listening and teach it to others, building bridges between our divisions. Imagine for a moment what that would be like. If people everywhere felt listened to, understood. Imagine what a world this could be. Maybe so. Our closing hymn this morning is number 318 in your gray hymnals, We Would Be One. Please stand as you're able. you return to your order of service, let's join in saying our closing words. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil or evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. Honor all beings. chalice. Please join me in our chalice extinguishing words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of wisdom, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and in our hands, until we are together again. Please stay for some refreshments.